Hey, I want to welcome Blas Falconer to the Meacham Writers Workshops and
Thanks for
a
having
little interview series. And we've been traditionally asking people to start by reading a poem, and then we'll just sort of head out from there.
Okay. I'm going to read a poem from my first book. It's a dramatic monologue. It's one of the first poems, and it was inspired by the first documented murder on the island of Puerto Rico. And it's written in the voice of a Taino Indian. It's called The Given Account, Puerto Rico, 1510. They said they were gods, and we believed. They crossed uncrossable seas after all, in ships with sails like wings. But Salcedo is dead, pacing river shallows, turning rocks, sifting sand for flecks of gold. He cut his foot on stone or shell, sending braids of blood downstream. Overhead, wind shook trees, so leaves and light spilled in, catching a school of fish, a silver shimmer. I was there. Kneeling on the bank, I dressed his wound, pressing strips of cloth to stop the flood. But red spots seeped through the weave, my fingers wet with blood. His blood, no different from mine. He winced, his face paled by pain, but nothing changed. No dove, no cloud, no beam of light, and he a god or son of God? I, who came to drink, struck dumb by one thought, they bleed, they die, led him back into the pool and pushed his head below. His arms thrashed, legs kicked, lungs inhaled, mouths of water. He stopped. 3 days I stayed to see him stir, but he, not strongest, weakest, or cruelest of them, did not move. I pulled him out. He hung wet and limp and heavy in my arms. This man, almost too much to bear.
Oh, thanks very much.
Welcome.
How did that, where did you begin? How did that poem begin?
I never know how a poem is going to begin, but I had just heard about this legend about Diego Salcedo, the first documented murder on the island, murder of a Spaniard, right? I'm sure many of the Tainos had been killed, they had been enslaved. Sure. And I just thought it was a compelling story, and I wondered what it might be like to write in his voice, but I had no other like motive or idea beyond that. And as I started to construct the scene, I decided that I would go ahead and I'd write it in blank verse so that it sounded kind of conversational. And as I started to construct the scene, I started to imagine how it happened and why it happened. And it's fiction. I made it up, of course. But I just kind of followed it through to the end. And then I realized when I got to the end that the poem was about that moment when someone you have kind of romanticized or put on a pedestal falls, and how that can be both crushing and empowering when you're a god or maybe a parent figure or that's empowering, but then it's also could be kind of crushing too, kind of sad. You might experience some grief because of that. And that felt like something I could really identify with. And so, writing in this voice was just a device to try and articulate something that meant something to me personally. And so I just kind of arrived at it through this other kind of voice, this other story.
Yeah, it's interesting it's difficult when you're writing monologues. I've done a couple myself, and because you're taking on that other personality, but you also have your own personality,
Yes.
and there's this kind of tension between them. And I think when a monologue works well, you get a sense of that tension, the sense of discovery that you were making as a writer versus him and what he's thinking.
Right, right. Yeah, eventually those two things have to come together, I think. Or at least for me, I want it to mean something beyond, telling a story. There is something I'm trying to get out, but I don't necessarily have to tell my story in order to get it out, right? And yeah, and so, right, so it's a kind of it's a really compelling exercise for me to do.
It's also interesting that, a lot of times when people write monologues, I guess because traditionally they were sort of like in blank verse and one big block.
Yeah.
You've divided it up.
Yes.
And I think, and I especially could hear this, when I've heard it now a couple of times, when you've been reading, it's so lyrical. And you think of a monologue not as a lyric.
Right.
And so there's a kind of a lyrical voice that's also in there. It also has a kind of a tension to it.
The way I composed this poem, I remember very clearly. I wanted it to sit with me for a while. I didn't want to kind of write it in one burst. And so I very consciously wrote, like I said, in blank verse. And I knew that I was going to make a lot of leaps. It was going to be kind of compressed. And so I chose couplets, to write in couplets, to give that white space. And I remember saying, I'll just write 10 lines a day. And I would probably write about 10 lines and take quite a while to write them. And then the next day I would look at the lines and I'd usually cut about 8 of them. I just kept doing that. I just kept until the poem found itself. And so it did take on this lyric quality. My ear was more in charge rather than trying to kind of figure out the story. I was really paying attention to the music.
And the couplets give you, they're turning so much. They keep allowing you to sort of create a little arc where you're constantly changing tone and mood as you go through within that lyrical voice.
Right. It gives me the freedom. It gave me the freedom to do that. Right. So I really capitalized on that.
How do most of your poems begin?
Every time I start a poem, I wonder how I ever wrote a poem in the past. It's almost like I'm trying to figure it out again. So there's no real I don't have any method, but usually there's just something that resonates with me, a moment, an image, a snippet of language, and it just wants, it seems like it wants to be explored. And so I'll just kind of put it down on the page and see what happens. There's a poem in A Question of Gravity and Light that I wrote. It's called The Story of Winter, and it's about something that happened when I was younger to a family friend, and I'd been trying to write it for a long time, and I couldn't write the poem. And then one morning I woke up with this kind of this music in my head. It was like a line in my head. It was just the music of it. I didn't even have the words. And I went to the page and I just started kind of plugging in the words to make the sound of that line. And I just kept imitating it. That was my pattern. And the poem just kind of presented itself to me. That was how that poem came about. It's not normal for me. So I'm trying to remain open to the various ways that I can be inspired, right? So.
Who have been some of your influences?
A lot of writers. I'm always trying to read poets who don't write like me, so I can stretch and kind of maybe see what they're doing and learn from them. And it really depends on where I am at that time. So if I feel like the poems aren't imaginative, then I might read someone like Marianne Salmon, who when I read her work, I think it's very inspiring in terms of the way she leaps. Or if I think I want my poems to have more images, right? And I want the images to be more vivid, then I might read Susan Mitchell's Rapture, right? Which is, like, to me, one of the most kind of memorable books for that reason. So it really depends on kind of where I feel like I need to develop that muscle some more, right? Where the muscle's atrophying, and so I'll do that. I also read a lot from the canon. I love going back to the canon, and so and trying to play off of what's come before me. So, yeah.
And I guess when you're teaching, you're also doing that too.
Yeah.
Does the teaching affect your writing?
Oh, tremendously. I think the students are, first of all, they're very inspiring because they're fearless.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly,
they will do anything. They don't know that they're not supposed to do something, so they'll do it, and then they'll often get away with it.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I read their work and I think, wow, you know, that's you know, I need to remember that I can try anything.
Yeah.
So in that way, teaching is very, very inspiring and influences my work. But also, it always gives me this opportunity to go back to the tradition and talk about these poets that, you know, have really influenced me, and revisit their work, and, you know, those conversations that I have kind of sit with me a while and often make me kind of bring me back to poetry if I feel like I've, you know, been away from it for too long. So.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And,
yeah, it's a pleasure.
Right.